So, hello everybody. Thanks for coming back to the KCP seminar despite the summer heat. We are very pleased to have with us today Thejasvi Beleyur, who is a very, I think, inspirational and successful member of the cluster community, if I may say so. Thejasvi joined us via, I think it was shortly before you finished your PhD in Sewiesen on a medium cluster project, which he used very successfully to prepare for his future research plans. Was very successful then in receiving funding of a DFG Walter Benjamin Fellowship, then a cluster postdoc grant, and now with his own cult size Nexus group, which I think is just fantastic achievement within like 4 years or something. And he's a young parent too. So I think this is just very admirable. So we're very happy that he's here today and will present on his current research and hopefully also his new group. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra, for the introduction. Yes. So today I'm here to talk about active sensing collectives. And I guess I'm really, really happy to be giving this talk because it's sort of the moment where I'm sort of introducing the group and the work that we have been doing and are looking forward to do. So let's dive straight in. This is an echolocating bat coming in to attack an insect in complete darkness. Echolocating bats can do this because they emit really loud ultrasonic calls and listen for the faint returning echoes from objects around them, like this insect out here, for instance. However, what happens when you put just one more bat into the same place is essentially that every now and then the call from this bat is going to overlap the returning echo, and this means that our focal bat here doesn't detect the insect anymore. And you can imagine if you were to play this further on and on. So as you add more and more bats, forget about being able to detect insects. At some point you can imagine they may not be able to detect anything else apart from the really loud sounds coming from everywhere, and maybe detect each other only once in a while. And this is sort of like a common theme when many active sensing agents come together and form collectives or groups. And when I say active sensing agent, what I mean is either technological or biological individuals that emit energy into their surroundings to detect the objects around them. So it could be drones and rovers that use sonar or radar, or also echolocating bats that emit ultrasound into their surroundings. And in this sense, active sensing collectives by themselves are sort of a paradox, because when the individuals come together, they sort of create either too much, perhaps, useless information, or maybe even noise, if you want to call it that. The one interesting thing about active sensing agents by themselves is also that they are an example of minimal sensor agents. So in contrast to, for example, in the field of from a technological perspective, many robot platforms, for instance, they have multiple sensors, while active sensing agents are capable of just using one sensory modality, and that sort of makes them computationally and energetically efficient to work with. Now, typically, from the technology perspective, when you have multiple agents or nodes that are emitting or transmitting signals, you can do a whole bunch of things. You can either coordinate the signal emission in time. So here the different colors are the emissions or transmissions from different agents. So here we have 2 agents and each one is occupying 50% of the time. You can sort of partition them in frequency. So here the blue agent is on the lower frequency and the orange agent is on the higher frequency, or you could do some sort of a combination. The one trick, however, the one challenge here, however, is that the moment you start to partition, you're already sort of hitting a barrier. So here we're with 2 agents, and it seems like there's a lot of space to work with, but the moment you start increasing your group size, already you're going to start hitting limitations on how much time or frequency each agent can occupy. Also, since it's centralized, you need some sort of a central global controller, and that itself is intensive to manage, coordinate, and synchronize. There are other decentralized approaches that are also out there. In the time domain, for instance, there are all of these time adjustment protocols. Two examples are CSMA and Aloha. And here, essentially, each agent or node is always monitoring its environment and seeing whether there's something being transmitted. And the moment it detects a transmission, it stops its own transmission, waits for some time, and then proceeds. As you can imagine, maybe it works really well with 2, 3, or small group sizes, but the moment you start to increase your group size, effectively, most agents end up waiting a lot before they have their own transmission. And the same sort of holds also in the frequency domain. So what happens in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth protocols, for instance, is that each agent, so there are, given frequency bands, and each agent sort of hops through the different frequency bands over time. But as you can imagine, as you have more and more agents there too, finding an unoccupied band can get tricky, and also like jumping between each of these bands is, again, computationally intensive. And so in this context, when you think about all of these constraints here, and you look at where technological active sensing agents have come or are demonstrated, you see that typically the demonstrations are 2 to 5 agents at a time. And so here you have 5 drones that are flying, and they're using narrowband pulses to estimate their relative distance to each other to form configurations. There is one exception, which is the kilobots. That's a group of 1,000 robots. But again, they use CSMA, which means they spend a lot of time sort of waiting until a transmission gets through. In contrast to this 2 to 5 typical group size, if we look at echolocating bats, they're orders of magnitude, ahead. So echolocating bats comfortably move and fly in large groups, ranging from tens all the way to hundreds and thousands and so on. So the question is, how are echolocating bats doing this? We don't know. And can we use the control that robotic platforms provide us to investigate the mechanisms behind this? And perhaps, maybe, from what we understand of what echolocating bats can do, maybe perhaps feed it back into some sort of successful protocol, perhaps. And if you're wondering what these 3 words are, active sensing collectives, and why haven't I heard of it, don't be surprised, because it's the name I made up for the research group that I started 3 months ago. And this talk is essentially sort of to set up the background behind the research group, like where we're coming from, and what we are doing right now, and where we hope to go in the future. So, the thing that we're studying is essentially an inverse problem. We know that lots of bats can fly together and echolocate in large groups. And sort of the challenge with inverse problems is, at some point, you begin to lose the appreciation for how challenging it actually is. Because you have a working solution, and any explanation you think of, you're like, okay, that must work, and that explains it because it's working. And so here I want to start by essentially showing you where the problem lies in flying when there are so many bats echolocating together. So let's start with a group of 5 bats here, and we're going to monitor what the central bat is hearing and experiencing. So the central bat, to detect this neighboring bat, needs to hear this echo, this orange line. So that's the call of the central bat that bounces off this neighbor and goes back. However, there are 2 types of sounds that sort of interfere or jam the detection of this orange echo, which is the direct call of this neighbor here, right, that goes straight to our neighboring bat, and what are called second order echoes. So the call of this bat hitting another neighbor and then coming back to this focal bat. I'm only drawing the lines from this particular neighbor, but we should actually be drawing all of these red lines from all of the neighbors, right? And so as you begin to add more and more bats into the group, you can imagine right, at some point it gets really messy. It's just filled with lots of sounds coming from everywhere. And if I were to summarize it really quickly, that's what I think like a bat in the group is experiencing. It's constantly hearing these, incessant stream of sounds, and it's just a lot of sounds coming from everywhere. So how do they manage? And this is the question I set out to answer, which is, does echolocation even work in large groups? So what I did during my PhD was essentially to build a biologically parameterized model of echolocating bats in groups, which is only using existing data on what individual bats can do, for example, in the lab or in the field. I asked if I put it all together and then put lots of these bats in a group without making too many assumptions, could echolocation still work? Which means essentially putting in all sorts of details about how well they hear, how loud they call, and how directional the sound is, how reflective bats are as targets, how far apart they fly, and sort of the basic physics of how the sound propagates. And what did I find? So firstly, I did find that neighbors can be detected by echolocation even in large groups. So here on the y-axis is the number of neighbors detected per call emission, and on the x-axis is the group size. It's not a linear scale, but the x-axis is going to remain constant for the next 2 or 3 plots. So if we look at what happens in small groups, right, so groups of 5 and 10, you see that basically the central bat's detecting everyone around it. So in groups of 5, you detect 4 bats, in groups of 10, you detect 9 bats. Just follow the green line. It's the optimistic estimate. Once you hit already a group size of 30, you see that even though there are 30 bats all around, right, our central bat's only able to detect about maybe 10 bats or so that are around it. And finally, as you hit the largest detectable group size of 100, what you see is that even though there's a really large group all around it, our focal bat here only detects 1 neighbor at most. So when you're trying to do any sort of collective movement, it's not only important how many neighbors you can detect, but also how well you can detect them, or over time, how often you can detect them. So here on the y-axis is the probability of detecting any neighbor at all, right? So if we follow the blue line, that's the probability of detecting at least 1 neighbor. The black line is detecting no neighbors. So you see that over the course of the increase in group size, first it's sort of flat and then it drops. But importantly, even at group sizes of 100, there's about a 30% probability of detecting at least 1 neighbor. Yeah. Well, so the definition of detecting is essentially if the echo from that neighbor is above a signal to noise threshold that's set from, yeah. So whether it stands above or below this threshold with respect to all of the other sounds, the calls and the second order echoes. Yeah. And right, so what does a 30% probability of detection mean? So if we assume, for example, the very stereotypical call rate of 10 calls per second, this means that at least 1 neighbor is detected about 3 times per second. So if you want to look at it in sort of a schematic, what does this sort of 3 times a second neighbor detection mean? So we have this focal bat here. There are other bats everywhere, but you can see that most of the time it's not detecting any of the neighbors. And even when it is, it's detecting most of the time only 1 neighbor at a time. So it's sort of not only stroboscopic, but it's sort of hyper-stroboscopic. And also, of the neighbors that are detected, where are they detected in space? So on the y-axis here is the azimuthal angle. So at small groups, essentially, neighbors are detected all around, so front and back. As you increase the group size to medium-ish groups, there's a slow forward bias. And then finally, at the largest group sizes, you see that the bat's only detecting neighbors that are plus minus 60 degrees left and right. So in summary, echolocation in groups computes. So if you put together everything we know about what bats can do as individuals and you put them in groups, they could be using echolocation, is what I showed. They will suffer low update rates because of the kind of noise that's always in the background. The one neat thing is that this frontal bias prediction was sort of supported in a recent experimental paper of Tadarida brasiliensis that formed these massive emergences in the wild. And they showed that the individuals tend to be most influenced by the movement of their frontal neighbors. Also, just around this time, I should also cite the work of Mazar and Yovel, who also did similar modeling studies and showed that only echolocation can sustain movement in groups. And I think the most important part of this whole modeling exercise was also just the fact that it now creates a framework to sort of think about the different variables that could be important and test, create a structure to test our ideas and the data that we will collect. There are still open questions, of course. I mean, for example, here in the particular results, all of the results that I showed you, the focal bat was in the center. But perhaps as you move away, the situation improves. Does that create some sort of a sensory or motor advantage for bats in groups? The other thing that bats do is that they show the three types of classic collective movement that are known. So swarming, where there's sort of random movement, milling, this kind of circular movement, and emergences, these linear, sort of very polarized movements. What effect does that have on how they're able to detect each other? So this also remains to be investigated. And sort of Aditya here is working on extending the modeling framework to answer these kinds of more detailed questions. Of course, I think the most important question is, I keep saying echolocation could sustain, echolocation may sustain. And the big question is, are they even using echoes to move in these large groups? Because, as you may see from this colorful picture that looks really bad right now, this is the echo, right? And it's actually the faintest sound amongst all of the sounds that are available to the bat flying in the group. In principle, the most reliably heard sound is actually the call from the neighbor. Perhaps they're using the calls of the neighbor, or maybe even these secondary echoes. So that remains an open question that this particular static simulation doesn't answer. And so sort of at this point was where I was like, So to actually answer these kinds of questions, we actually need a dynamic simulation. And already with just the static simulation that I had built, it was extremely computationally intensive. You need to imagine that the thing about modeling sound is that you have a sound source, and then when it hits an object, it sort of spawns reflections, and then these reflections spawn other reflections. So it starts to get rather intensive really quickly. And this is when, exactly around that time, I was at the cluster fall retreat in 2023, and Heiko Hamann gave his talk, and then afterwards I sort of just started thinking and talking with him and said, maybe we should make lots of robot bats and sort of see what happens. And especially since simulation is so intensive, and when simulation is so intensive, the advantage of having a robotic platform to do the thing that you want to simulate is just that all of the effects sort of come for free or come as part of the robot platform. So, you have the speaker, it emits sound, and then the objects around you reflect naturally, which are picked up by the microphone. So all of the essential details of the problem can be recreated, and scalability shouldn't be a problem in principle. And this is where then Heiko brought in Giovanni, and we started working on the Robat. And the advantage of the Robat, in contrast perhaps to some of the other robotic echolocating or bat-like platforms, is that it's a low-cost robot platform. So it's built on the Thejasvi, which is an educational robot platform. It's built mainly from commercially available parts. So stuff you can order online, the audio interfaces, the speakers, the microphones, and it's easily prototyped. So there's no machine code, or there's not much, or maybe none, I'm not sure. Well, there's none to little machine code involved. It's all controlled via Python and a Raspberry Pi. And Alberto here is the one who sort of pioneered the work and built the first version of the Robat. That's what it looks like. So we have a microphone array here and a speaker that produces sound. What I'm showing you here is work that was inspired by a previous paper that showed that perhaps individual bats themselves Vanderelst et al. In 2015. They showed in a simulation model that individual bats themselves could be using a really simple sort of rule to avoid obstacles, which is they look at where the loudest echo comes from and they move away from it. And so we thought, what if we applied this to groups? So here, what you're seeing is the robat, that's the one with the QR code, and all of these white squares are other sound sources. So what you see the robat doing here, the passive sensing robat, is essentially it's moving and then it hears the sound coming from this source, okay, and then it moves in the opposite direction. And as you can see, just using this simple rule, it's able to sort of avoid obstacles that are also producing sounds. And in this, the analogy is the sounds are other bats. The next generation of the robat we have now is the active sensing robat. So this is actually closer to an echolocating bat, while this is closer to a generic animal that produces sound and does social behavior. So here we have an ultrasonic speaker that can blast really loud ultrasound and a smaller microphone array. And here we see the same sort of thing. Essentially, here now we're closer to implementing what was proposed in the simulation framework here. And so this, let me go back. Yeah. So the robat starts, it's constantly emitting calls wherever the echo comes from first. And if it's loud enough, it moves in the opposite direction. And so you can see it's able to avoid this intricate maze of obstacles. Also look at the path out here on a different configuration. This is, of course, just one robat, but we're in the end interested in doing this with multiple robats. And so where do we go from here? So there are a whole bunch of open avenues. The first thing is, of course, is to potentially do synthetic evolution, which is you leave a whole bunch of robats together and you let them evolve their own movement, call rate, call intensity, all these sorts of parameters, which part of the audio they pay attention to, and you see which kinds of strategies end up working. For instance, we could vary in a controlled way group size, what strategies work in small groups versus what work in large groups, and we could also vary group geometry. So we force a group geometry on them and we see which strategies work when everyone's sort of flying in a predictable straight path versus, for example, on the other extreme, everyone's flying in a sort of completely unpredictable path. Having heard all of this computation and some swarm robotics, you may now finally be wondering, but what do bats actually do in groups? Right? And I think the short answer is they do all kinds of things. And here I'm just trying to show a schematic on a 4-dimensional axis. So these are the sort of like the 4 variables that bats could alter when they're faced with some sort of a sensory challenge. So they could alter the frequency range, that is how like the starting and the ending points of their calls. So also this is what a typical bat call looks like. So it's a sweep, so it's like choop. That's what it sounds when you slow it down. So they could change the frequency range, which is the starting and the ending frequencies of their call. They could change their call rate, so whether they call 10 times a second, 20 or 50 times a second. So that sort of corresponds to the update rate that they want. Or they could change their call duration. So maybe if they want to avoid overlapping with each other, they call shorter calls. But at the same time, maybe if they really want to get a detection, they emit louder calls. So it can go in both directions. And finally, they could do the thing that many animals do, which is to, call louder when there's a background noise. And this is the Lombard effect, essentially, that's common across many animals. And what you typically end up seeing when you sort of summarize a bunch of studies is that if what you see on top is a schematic spectrogram, so frequency and time, y and x-axis. So if in the single or the control treatment, the bat is flying with a particular call rate, a particular frequency range and duration, what you see is when you expose the bat to noise or you put it in a group, a whole bunch of things change. So maybe it's going to change its frequency range, it'll change the call rate, the call duration, and the call level. So it'll change all of these things, most likely because it's sort of physiologically constrained that a lot of things change together. The thing that I began to notice, having done this modeling, was essentially that experiments done so far in the lab I mean, that's the best place to do it because you have a controlled setting, you can fix a group size. They have like a small group bias. So you have groups of 2 to 5 and a maximum of 10 individuals at a time. But if you compare these numbers with the plot out here with the probability of neighbor call detection, you see that this lies exactly in the range of no challenge, just putting it simply, which means that there are experiments, but the experiments don't necessarily challenge the echolocation of the bat. And I understand there are logistical reasons of not wanting to put more bats, and perhaps even if you do put more bats into the same room, they're not going to fly at the same time. So that is one sort of limitation here. The other approach to sort of understanding how bats manage in groups is to put a bat into a room, one bat, and you play really loud sounds from everywhere with many, many speakers. The challenge there, again, is that the sound field is very hard to make uniform across the room. So the bats can often sort of go in and out of good spots and bad spots. And honestly speaking, there aren't that many speakers that can produce sounds as loud as real bats. So even these experiments don't necessarily challenge the bat to the extent that they are when they're out in the field. Okay, so let's ditch lab experiments or flight room experiments. Let's go out in the field. And here too, I noticed that there's sort of a bimodal sampling here that's happening. So one approach is essentially to go up there in front of a group of bats and start recording what they're doing. And this approach is essentially to collect whatever data you can, and whatever you can analyze, you take it. But there's a challenge here, which is you don't know who emitted the call, when they emitted it, or why they emitted it. But you are able to sort of characterize a diversity of calls and strategies and maybe sort of come to some sort of a broad conclusion on what's happening. The other approach, now also facilitated by the dropping costs of these types of technology, is to put on-body tags and record with really high spatiotemporal resolution what a few individuals are doing over time. But the challenge is that you know what's happening with one individual over the course of perhaps an hour or a day or whatever time span is involved, but you don't know and you can't assure that the other tagged individuals are nearby. So you have no further social context. And where I think we need to go is to sort of achieve a network approach, which is to be able to capture, of course, this was done with fish and not with bats, but the idea is to be able to capture as many or all individuals and all of their sensory inputs and motor decisions in the field. And this was sort of like the goal, essentially. And to do this, back in 2018, I went into a cave in Bulgaria. This is a fly-through example of like the path that a bat may take when flying through the cave. You see it goes down this corridor, and then it ends here, and then there's only one entrance and exit. And this is like one of my microphone array frames. Better photo is this here. So you see there's like a frame, and then there are 3 thermal cameras, and anywhere between 11 to 22 microphones spread across this volume. And, while in principle having this multi-sensor data set seems nice, so we have the thermal cameras that we can use to reconstruct flight paths. We have the microphone arrays that we can use to reconstruct their echolocation or call decisions. And we have the LiDAR to put everything into sort of real-world coordinates, right? In principle, it sounded like a really good idea, but multi-sensor and multi-bat problems are something else, I slowly started to realize. So already in 2022 or 23, with Bastian, Julian started working on this problem of trying to figure out, we have the LiDAR scan of the cave and we have the thermal cameras, but we don't know where the thermal cameras are in the LiDAR scans. So Julian started trying to solve this problem. And what he quickly realized was that all of the algorithms out there were essentially built on the assumption that you're working with industrial or urban settings, which is clean contrasts, sharp edges, and recognizable features, essentially. But if you already look at this scene of a cave, like firstly, most of the cave is around 10 degrees Celsius. So it's thermal data. So it's really uniform. So that's sort of useless for these algorithms. And it's a cave with smooth walls. So one part of the cave looks like another part of the cave. But in the end, Julian was able to find some sort of a semi-automated compromise, and we were able to figure out where the cameras were in the LiDAR space. This was already just one of the issues. The second issue is a more inherent issue to studying bats in groups, which is, this is 4 microphones and this is a spectrogram, so frequency and time here. Each of these sweeps is a bat call, and this is the kind of recording you would get when maybe about 10 bats are flying around in space. What you see here is essentially the kind of nightmare data set that most people who analyze audio don't want to work with, because it's very hard to say which call belongs to which bat. So typically when you have one bat or 2 bats, there's some sort of a consistency from one call to the other, and you can sort of assign, okay, this is that bat, that's that bat. The moment you have more than that and you're doing it inside a cave, you start to run into other problems, which is sometimes you can't even say whether, for example, this particular sound here, whether it's a direct call that's arriving at the microphone or it's a reflection. So it's a bat calls, it hits a wall, and then it comes to your microphone. So there's 2 kinds of assignment challenges already, right? And well, this is one of the challenges with working with this type of data. We could sort of solve some of the problems with assignment by now moving beyond the Ushchka dataset, that's the old dataset, and using an acoustic camera, putting that into this multi-sensor rig. So each of these bright blips here you're seeing is essentially a time point where a sound was emitted. So acoustic cameras are small compact microphone arrays that can tell you the angle of arrival. So it'll tell you, okay, there was a sound here, there was a sound there. And the idea is once you put in the acoustic camera, it should solve some of the assignment problems. But it won't solve all of them. And this is where another focus of the group is essentially to investigate good sensor fusion, experimental and computational workflows. So what sort of objects work experimentally to bring all of the sensors together into the common coordinate system, but also what algorithms and methods can help us localize this type of complex audio and find out who emitted a call when. The one other thing which I find really exciting is essentially that nowadays when you're working with multiple cameras, it's fairly easy to do 3D triangulation with them, because all you need to do is to put your camera somewhere, move around with a calibration object, and there are algorithms out there that use the fact that, you know, this one object has a fixed size and it should be the same wherever in space it is. And just using these types of assumptions, they can back calculate where the cameras were and give you the pose of the cameras. That same type of method doesn't exist for microphone arrays, which means that typically in the past, people have had to use frames and linear arrays on, you know, aluminum rods and things like this to fix the positions of the microphones and then sort of do your acoustic tracking with it. But of course, using these types of fixed geometries means that you can't go anywhere you want, or if you're in a cave and then the array doesn't fit, then you're running into problems. Kalle Astrom in University of Lund has been working on this problem of microphone self-positioning, and we've sort of been using the data I collected over. So this should actually be a video of me, you know, moving around with a speaker on a rod. And just using this input of these playback chirps, you get this sort of microphone, the inferred microphone positions. And it picks up the geometry of the microphone array really well, I will say. On the line of computational and algorithm development, there is one thing that I've invested a lot of time and energy into, which is trying to keep scientific software and code as reusable as possible. I find it to be a bit of a pity that we sort of treat code and software as a discardable resource, because oftentimes we put in a lot of time and energy into writing a piece of code or software that does a particular task, but then we kind of neglect it, which means after 3 months, maybe I myself can't use the same piece of code that I wrote. Or even worse, something really detailed has been done, and then this person leaves, and then the next person comes in trying to take over the project, but they either have to redo it or they spend a lot of time figuring out how it works. And so I've been sort of investing a lot of time and energy into trying to make it easily installable, writing documentation, and hoping that we can sort of push this type of a culture. Right. So we've collected all of this multi-sensor data. We've built our computational workflows. We've gotten some output. What are we going to do with it? Now, the broad idea is essentially that since we have all of these theoretical predictions, I mean, the details are not important here, but we have certain theoretical predictions, it gives us concrete things that we can test against in our data. And so, for example, we also expect that this hyperstroboscopic neighbor detection happens. So we have all sorts of predictions that we expect at different group sizes, and also which parameters can have the most effect in improving or worsening the problem of echolocating bats. So what we get in the end will be, we know where each bat is in space, right? We know when each bat emitted a call. Since we know the distance of all the neighbors and where the wall is, we can calculate the echoes, when they will arrive, and we apply the same logic onto each of the bats in the group. And that means we can reconstruct all the sensory inputs and the motor flight outputs. And the nice part about having this multi-sensor data set is essentially that we're not doing this in some abstract 3D space. We're doing it in situ, in context, which means that we can interpret and sort of more strongly infer why an individual did what it did. So if it was flying and it made a sudden turn, was it because there was another bat flying, in the opposite direction, or was it that the curvature of the cave was like this? So it allows us like much more insight. And so I'm coming to the end of my talk. And with this so far, I hope I've sort of given you a feel for like all of the various facets of and sort of branches of investigation that we sort of have been doing, are doing, and would like to continue doing. I'd like to end by acknowledging all of the people who have supported me in one way or the other to this place out here. And actually, Alexandra really nicely summarized all of the things that happened only because of me being in the cluster. So I think the cluster deserves a special acknowledgement, essentially, for me being at the point where I am right now. Yes. And with that, I'm going to end with these cute videos of the bats and the robots. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Thejasvi, for the beautiful talk. Yeah, who wants to go first? The question.
Really fantastic to see this overview. Slightly ironic that you ended up kind of facing exactly the same problem you're trying to understand with your data set at the end. But I was wondering right from the start, you talk a lot about the different protocols that the bats could follow.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there are any idiosyncrasies to their calls that they might be able to identify to distinguish their own call from someone else's generally.
So, yes and no, I guess. The one thing is that echolocation itself is extremely flexible. So, a bat that's emitting one type of call, for 200 seconds could suddenly switch it to become like another call. So it could be a really straight linear call, and then it becomes a very shallow call, a short call, very suddenly. So the bat changes its own calls really quickly as it's calling to adapt with the environment. That's one thing. The second thing is whether bats have a voice. So like we humans can recognize each other's voices. I'm not entirely sure whether this would hold true for the echolocation calls. I mean, to be honest, there's one set of studies which captured wild bats and released them and tried to see if echolocation calls have a signature. They don't find anything. But on the other hand, there's also there's a study of 5 bats and they're being trained to sit in a consistent position in front of a microphone. And then with the 5 bats, you can pick up individual signatures. Yes, the question is, if you were to scale this 5 bats to 10, 20, 50, would that still remain? I don't know, right? And also, honestly, I think it's just tricky to study experimentally, because where the microphone is, how far the bat is, what the bat is like focusing on acoustically, all of that could change sort of what you pick up. But there is this idea, at least with the Tadarida brasiliensis, that fly out in really large emergences. I'm not sure if it's like been established, but there is this idea that there is some amount of individual call variation.
Yeah, let me know if this is a dumb idea. So basically, so all your simulations and work kind of focus on where the individual can detect.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But has anyone thought of or looked at the other part, like the noise? Like,
yeah.
I'm imagining the soup of sounds
yep.
bouncing around, right? Would it be possible where this soup has some emergent properties that reflects the environment, like the cave size? You know, like everyone's shouting. So like this noise might provide some information
yep.
that the bat can use, right? So have
yes.
you thought that direction as well, or
yes,
not really? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, so I think a whole bunch of people have been thinking around this direction, which is maybe it's not about the echoes, maybe it's about everything aside from the echoes. So actually, it was a recent paper in, well, a few weeks ago or a month ago or something like this in PLOS Computational Biology, again by Andrelez et co. That and all at looked at this question, which is, what if bats are not using the own, like, I mean, they were able to sort of systematically do this like a controlled simulation study. So what happens if bats are only using the echoes? What happens if bats are using only the calls or the other sounds, if I'm not wrong? So they were able to do this too. Yeah. So, I mean, basically bats don't have to use echoes. Yeah. When they're flying out in groups. But again, that's the thing. Experimentally, there's still a lot to be like figured out. Yeah.
So you clearly illustrated how much of an incredibly difficult challenge this is for the poor bats.
Yeah.
Flying these groups and being bombarded with all those noises and still being able to capture prey. But do they actually do that? I mean, wouldn't be it sounds so difficult that I find it very hard to imagine that any system could possibly solve it somehow.
Yeah.
But wouldn't be the simplest solution. So in a dense group, you just don't catch prey ever. Okay, so now one would need to ask a biologist to is it actually happening? And in the caves, the solution is very simple. Like in your robot simulation from 2015, you just, when there is some really strong loud noise, which indicates you're either close to the wall or you're close to another bat, you turn away from this, means you will never collide, and you will not collide against the wall. And that's, you will not collide with the wall and you will not collide with another bat. That's the only rule you implement to successfully fly within your cave. Once you're outside, if you implement that same rule, you would disperse and your group would essentially fly off each other, and then you're removing this problem, and then you become capable of catching prey again. So asking the other way around, is there actually, in your very first video, you showed very nicely that the bat is catching the prey, but how frequently is this actually happening when the bats are in a very close community? And has anyone experimentally measured that? Prey, so if you would release a moth inside the cave with all those other moths, could that moth actually be captured or not?
Yes, so actually there are 2 or 3 species of bats that sort of constantly face this problem. There's a couple of species of bats that essentially fly really high up in the sky, and they capture insects that are sort of in swarms that are sort of localized in space. So there, essentially, they fly up and then they're looking for these insect swarms. So that's exactly where this type of situation happens. Although, to be fair, like the insect was more an illustrative example, but there you do see that multiple bats will come close together and capture insects. And sort of modeling studies from this group in Israel, they showed essentially that just the fact that bats change their calls as they come in to capture insects, for instance, that itself creates sufficient variation, context-wise variation, to allow multiple individuals to capture insects close together. So, but that's one type of bat, and that's a very specific ecological case. But I mean, in the caves, you're right. So the question is, they could be avoiding the loudest sound. The loudest sound, however, whether it's the reflection or it's the direct call, hard to say. The thing with the relying on other sounds is that you don't necessarily know too much about how far away it is, right? So, I mean, if I speak close to this mic, it's loud, but if I'm far away, then it gets really faint. So the same thing happens with bat calls. If the bat is pointing somewhere else, it sounds faint, but if it's pointed at you, it sounds loud. So that's sort of like a relatively unreliable cue, I would say, versus like an echo that is always bound to come at a predictable delay. So that's where I'm always wondering, like, where the bats are prioritizing. I mean, something that's not always detectable, but is sort of reliable and predictable, versus, an abundance of sounds that you can't necessarily control or predict. That remains to be seen, I think.
We have a question here by Ari, who is joining online. And she writes, great talk. I wanted to ask about the general problem of doing collective movement with discontinuous information about your group mates. We have a similar situation in meerkats, and it happens in a lot of species where individuals give contact calls at a certain rate, and then animals use them to maintain cohesion. My question is, do you think there is something fundamentally different about how animals coordinate or should coordinate when they have this kind of discontinuous info? Or is it essentially the same as the strategy you'd use for continuous info, only, in brackets, only degraded?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because you're essentially coming back to, so this question was actually studied in, I think Bode et al., 2000, I don't remember the year now, but they essentially studied exactly this. So they call their model the limited interactions model. And so they flipped the assumption. So the sort of canonical assumption is that if I'm the focal individual, I can detect all of my neighbors, and I sort of somehow, sum up all of this sensory information. They flipped this assumption and they said, what if you can't detect all of your neighbors? And in a really weird parallel, they actually assumed that the probability of neighbor detection is proportional to the distance. So you detect your nearest neighbors better than your farthest, a neighbor that's further away, which matches the echolocation and perhaps even the broader acoustic case really well. And also, like, the picking is random across space. So what they found essentially was, even if you put this type of an assumption, you still sort of recover the typical collective movements. And what I take away is essentially that the only thing that this does is to perhaps change the rate of this collective movement, because in effect, it's still more or less the same. You're always sort of integrating, but it's happening over multiple calls or sounds or emissions, rather than like one sweep integration, essentially.
Great, thanks so much. Are there any other questions?
It's related to James's question, one of the papers you showed, jamming avoidance response, electric fish, very well studied.
Yes.
Where they really trying to move the frequency apart in order to have not that problem. Let's do that.
So the thing with electric fish also, it's very interesting, because that jamming avoidance response was specifically studied under lab conditions, where you see this sort of, you give a stimulus and then the fish moves. Now, of course, like, as you start to go back into the wild and you look at what happens, you see basically that many electric fish species are quite social, and then like you can look under a tree root or something in the water, and then you'll find like 4 or 5 of them together. So the thing is whether, like, so essentially, maybe it's not such a problem. It's a question of what kind of stimulus you do. The thing with the jamming avoidance response in bats in specific, that has sort of, to my understanding, been sort of convincingly sort of disproved more or less through a combination of modeling and experimental studies by this group in Israel, where they essentially showed that the responses you see, this change of frequencies, that's not the bats necessarily actively avoiding overlap, but rather that's just them reacting to other bats as objects. So because bats naturally do this, they change their calls a lot as they encounter new situations. So when you see an object coming close, then you change the call too. And in this case, it's sort of like either sweeping the frequency range up or down. So it
seemed to synchronize. I mean, one band went up and the other band went up as well.
That
In the spectrogram.
This one.
Yeah.
I know. So this is.
Maybe I read it wrong.
I don't know. So this is a collection of various call types that you find here.
Yes, I see focal bed. On the right, for example, or maybe I'm reading it wrong. And frequency goes down while the other one also goes down.
I need to look into this, but I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards, like to look at this in context.
I just thought you're showing the frequency band of one bed and the other one, and then but maybe it's something else.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at it in the context of the paper also. Yeah.
There is another question from Yichak, who also joined online. Thank you for a very clear and interesting talk. Would you or others also consider the cost of calling? E.g., maybe individuals will call less when others are calling to save energy while benefiting from the calls of others.
Well, this is the standard understanding is essentially that echolocation calls don't impose a very high metabolic cost. When bats are constantly calling really loudly, then yes, it creates an excess metabolic cost. But when they're flying and calling, typically what happens is they couple the wing movements with the diaphragm movement. And so therefore they sort of get 2 in 1 at the same time. So echolocation calls, when they're happening at baseline levels, they probably don't really have a big effect.
If there are no other questions, let me thank you again for the great talk.
Yes.
And to all of you for coming today. And please join us again next week. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.